We're very pleased to have our 4 panelists here at the Great Greenfield DinoFest to talk about local history and dinosaur history. Here we have Alice Nash, who is an associate professor of American history at UMass. Fred Venn, who's the museum educator at the Benesky Museum. Sarah Doyle from PVMA and the Jurassic Roadshow, and a local Dexter Marsh expert. Mm-hmm. And David Brule, president of the Nolan Beaker Project. So welcome to you 4. Thank you so much for being here. Okay. And I think what we'd like to start is just let you talk for a minute or so, about your own work and how your work maybe intersects with local history, particularly sort of local history around this dinosaur track discovery in the 1800s. And just let us in a little bit on your world.
Great. Should we just go down the road?
Yeah, let's go down the road.
Great. Okay, so I am a historian. I'm really interested in early American history, which means anything after 1920 seems like gossip to me. I also am interested in the history of indigenous peoples. But I'm also from a family that's interested in dinosaurs and dinosaur tracks, and I grew up hunting fossils with my dad, and one of my relatives has a dinosaur quarry, and so I really enjoyed this play and the history that you represented, and the only thing I would have liked to see more of was sort of women in science, because in fact women were also, through the Mount Holyoke and Smith, women were just as interested in science as men. So that's the only thing that I would maybe have added.
Well, with regard to the play, I will add that they did at least tend to Ora White Hitchcock a bit, which was nice to see. And Ora White was a huge contributor. And being from Amherst College, I happened to be in a position to be kind of the caretaker of the collection. We have probably 1,000 slabs that are located within the Benesky Museum. We display about 200 of them to the public. We have the other 800 that are in the greater collection. And we have over 10,000 trackways that Hitchcock described. And having access to those on a daily basis and making them available to upwards of 20 to 30,000 people a year is kind of a privilege and an honor. So I get to, as I said, get to be the caretaker and the scaffolder of information.
Sarah?
Well, that was fun. It was really fun. It was really... I love the way in the play you really hit, you used a lot of real material.
Yeah.
I mean, everything that happened in there happened, pretty much. There were a couple of teeny, picky little things. But, you really, it was very much his real life, which I just thought was really nice and nicely done. It's hard to get women in doing that kind of history partly because they were not doing some of the same things that men were, even if they were doing things, and there aren't as many records, Even with Ora, we've got a picture of her when she's old. We don't have any pictures of her young, and whereas Edward was photographed even fairly young. I love the song at the end, Right Here in Greenfield. I think there are a lot of people who agree. Right here in Greenfield would be a really great place to have a Dexter Marsh Museum right across the street in the Bank Road building. And I think
that could be PVMA's next project, a little capital campaign. You got your own second museum.
I think we've got our campaign song. But that's just my initial response. I thought it was, and for me, also it's exciting because Dexter Marsh was a very obscure kind of person. And so to see him taking the center stage is really, much as I do love and respect Hitchcock also, it's really nice to see Dexter getting his due because he deserves it.
Yeah, I guess I'll haul it back to kind of following what Jonathan was suggesting, a little peek into the world that I've been inhabiting for the last couple of years. I'm the current president of the Nolan Beaker Project, which is basically a group of educators who endeavor to bring events and interactions with the local Indian tribes in the area. So we sponsor a number of events, but we're very closely allied with the Nipmuc and the Abenaki right in western Massachusetts, but also allied with the federally recognized tribes from southern New England, the Narragansetts and the Wampanoag. And curiously enough, our main focus really is right in this vicinity of what's now called Barton Cove, and where I believe a lot of the prospecting for tracks was undertaken, and as well as the hill that we have stewardship over, which is currently called Wissatinawag, which would be roughly the shining hill because of and before the dams across the river that flooded the quarries, there was a considerable mist that drifted onto those basalt rocks and cliffs. Also, we have just kind of trying to understand how the tribal people and this landscape might have intersected. There was, before the dam was built, there was a tremendous rock island, not really inhabitable, but it came to be known as Peskionska, and that we assumed meant this rock that split the river. But in our conversations with the Nipmuc linguists, whose home turf this was, they made more of a linguistic reference to the place where the fire came out of the rocks. So that I found very curious, because obviously that whole ridge line, even outside of Greenfield here and along Poet's Seat down to the edge of Wissatinawag at Factory Hollow is clearly volcanic and basalt flow, and we have pillow lava on the property. So there's something going on there that the native people, their oral tradition, they knew about something about this area. Not that they were contemporary to dinosaurs by a long shot, but they had a sense of this landscape. So, from my point of view, and having grown up right in that vicinity, that whole kind of like yourself, people who were so interested in the fossils that were there. My father was totally uneducated, unschooled, had to leave to join the Navy in World War II, but he was always fascinated, and there are a number of people in that vicinity who were farmers, or just regular people who knew they had fossils in their backyard. So it's always been there. Hearing stories about Louis Agassiz, who apparently was a celebrated paleontologist who visited the area. Just all of that is fascinating. And as an educator, I have to say that the way the information was woven into the songs, and what the kids learned by doing this, and what the chord that was struck among the young and old, I think it was just a fantastic production. Totally enjoyed it.
Thanks. Well, thank you for sharing these parts of your work. I'm just going to open up and see if any of us have particular questions. I mean, I have a few questions, but Linda?
Well, I have one question just about the collection at the Amherst College Natural History Museum. I love going and visiting all those slabs with the dinosaur tracks, but they're not labeled, a lot of them, as to where they came from. Is that a long-term goal to get labels on those?
That's a great question. When they were set up in the Vineski Museum, the choice was to not label them. It was purposeful, and the intent was to leave it open to other people coming in and making observations, not unlike Dexter Marsh or, Field or, Dean, or for that matter, Hitchcock. We have people that come in and they see things that nobody's seen before by walking through and not having everything labeled. That being said, there is a long-term goal to digitize the collection and then be able to bring the original Hitchcock definition of what the various trackways were with what we currently know. We have a gentleman named Paul Olson who is on sabbatical from Columbia. Right now, he will be at the Vineski in about 2.5 weeks, and he'll be staying on with us for a year. And part of the work that we will tap Paul on is just that: is what are we looking at today? And Paul is probably the national expert on dinosaur trackways, ichnology, the study of ichnology.
I know him actually from New Jersey.
Yes.
I worked for the I worked for the Essex County Environmental
Oh.
Parks Department, and he's the one who, as a teenager, discovered dinosaur footprints at the Riker Hill Park.
Yep, that's the same Paul.
Yeah.
and Paul, basically, off the record, even though we're being taped, Paul's the quintessential preschooler in a human adult body. He is the 5-year-old that can look at things in a divergent way and see things that nobody can see. And his ability to kind of come into our track collection and be able to see what hasn't been seen before has been instrumental to redefining what the trackways are all about for today. What Hitchcock saw what Paul Olson saw with his, with again, a woman scientist that was with him, Emma Rainforth, who was studying under him. They ended up taking all of Hitchcock's, wonderful work of, I guess he was a splitter of science. He saw many different things. I mean, he had probably 60, 70 ichnospecies to find when he was all done. Paul and Emma have taken that and kind of brought it down to about 4 or 5. And that's huge. And then, in addition to that, we have somebody like Stephen Gatesy from Brown, who's been in doing work on the motion of animals and what you kind of perceive from the, what were the muds and the substrates and how the interaction of the animals with those substrates and how that would play out. And he's been able to take and even reaffirm some of what Paul Olson had suggested. So there's more information coming. To go back to your question, are we going to have it labeled? No. Are we going to have it available so somebody could walk in and kind of walk through and have a guided tour, maybe even on a phone? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of our long-term goals. It's a great question. Yeah, it's a big project.
Because just working in Turner's Falls and having Turner's Falls be so famous for the footprints, it's when you walk in and you can see a track that came from Turner's Falls, and then just wondering where the rest of them were even found.
Yep,
So.
and it's funny. And at this point, what we do is, since we don't have that kind of available information out public, we have some of it. We have, probably 5% where we've got, what's on display, and we've got that clearly defined, and we have a little booklet to go with it. And we train our students that work in the museum to literally walk right over to the Dexter Marsh tracks. That's where we start. We always start with the Dexter Marsh tracks. And you've got those 2 beautiful sidewalk tracks, like the outside we have that wonderful painting, that's up, PVMA painting, and that's what we have. I mean, we go there, we start with that, and we explain kind of the history behind where they were, how they were located, how they were discovered. So our students are very comfortable with that, and then we take it a step further and we get closer to South Hadley with the Noah's Raven piece, so we can tie in not only the discovery, but then the Noah's Raven piece, which are the earliest evidence of dinosaur trackways that had ever been scientifically put into a collection scientifically. Certainly, what I love is that we go back further, and you've got the Native Americans who clearly saw all of this, and clearly some of their the stories that are related to the spirits that they saw within the rock helped lead the people like Marsh and Field and Hitchcock to some of these original sites. It wasn't by chance that they found these sites. There's history and mythology behind the sites, and that's carried over locally, but also internationally. If you follow the trails to the dragons, you can find the dinosaurs in China, in the Liaoning province. If you follow the trail of the Cyclops, you can find mammoths in the east. So that you follow the trail of some of the mythology, and you can find these original sites. And I think it's a wonderful part of what our history locally is. We can follow some of that local history right to those trackways, and how to bring that into the story is also a challenge.
There was I was going to say there was years ago. I gave a talk at the Historical Society of Greenfield, and there was this man in the audience whose name was George Bush, which stuck in my mind. And I don't know if he's still alive, but he said in the 1930s, he went down to New York City. He'd never been there before, and he was really overwhelmed. And he somehow ended up in the Museum of Natural History, just to get out of the way, Goes into the Museum of Natural History, walks down the hall, turns, and there's this big slab of rock there from Turner's Falls. And he said, wow, I just suddenly felt so connected to the world that I go to New York City and here's this thing. And I think that, some of these I don't know about Dexter Marsh's, but Roswell Field probably, some of his specimens are probably in London and Paris and museums in Europe.
Well, it's funny going to the Berkshire Museum. It's not on display now, but a while back when I went in
Yeah.
there and seeing a set of tracks and, talking about the labels and, there being a set of tracks saying that they were 35 million years old or something. Some date that was just very, very far off.
Yeah.
So.
You'd be happy to know if it's the same George Bush. He's alive and well and thriving, and he's a science teacher of mine, history, science and history.
Oh, cool.
So he's in his 90s, but he's walking up and down Avenue A.
We should get that
So,
story on tape.
fantastic. Yeah, we should. No, he's doing well.
That's great, thank you.
Well, tracks are nice, but those bones are so much more visceral. What do you learn from tracks that you don't learn from bones that have been dug up elsewhere?
What's important about the trackways is probably best highlighted by Stephen Gates's work. And Stephen Gates studies the gait of dinosaurs. You can't do any better than that, other than people like Marsh and Field going out in the marshes and the field and finding the trackways. You've got Gates studying it just works. It's amazing how all of this works. Not to mention, what was it, Miss
Rebecca Slate.
that
And
was
Mary
just-
the Slate. Yeah.
It's just too much.
Even Dean.
But the work with respect to how an animal will interact with different sediment, with different substrates, is Gates's work. And Gates has been doing that for the last decade, and he's been trying to looking at our trackways, looking at all the trackways that are out there, and trying to Hitchcock had a different definition for each one of them. Like where a foot might go into the mud and pull out and leave something behind. That's going to leave a certain kind of marking, and to split it, open it up, you get a different marking. So there's so many different things that could happen, and trying to explain those motions is where Gates's work is. So he's been working on, and what we're looking at is behavior through the trackways. So by looking at the trackways, we're looking at behavior, which we can't see, determine so much through the bones, the hard body parts, but through the trackways we can know where they were, what their environments were, what kind of substrates they were in, and what would be responsible for the substrates, which in turn tells you more about the environment. So it kind of keeps feeding back into what was the environment, what were the conditions, and how were these animals navigating. So that's the important part of it.
And also partly do they travel in packs or individually?
Well, actually, I don't know the science technology end of it. Are we able to use like ground penetrating radar or something to study tracks in situ? Or because once you pull them up and they're all come in layers, and how are you studying? Can you track one dinosaur walking across the valley without digging it up?
Is it possible to do that? It's funny because I met with somebody that does that kind of work about a month ago.
Yeah.
Of course, it was a salesperson, and they came to the museum with their wares, and they do work for real companies that are spending millions of dollars to find things of real value. Not that the dinosaur tracks are not valuable, but they're looking at it for a whole different reason. But when we talk, so the bottom line is it is possible to do that. So there is ground penetrating technology that can actually track them over. If you go down to Connecticut, Rocky Hill, Connecticut, Dinosaur State Park, you'd be able to do that whole site.
And do layers,
And
maybe
do layers.
Yeah, which would be awesome.
But what Gates's work is he doesn't do that. He actually creates his own substrates and literally takes turkeys, runs them through his backyard, gets a little, what you call it, like a trough to run them through, runs them through that, has it all filmed, slow motion, watch them through the mud, and then he comes back and creates some digital, work related to what happened there. So we're able, and then he also has the evidence of what happened. So it's a nice way of, we can recreate, we try to model and recreate, and then we can infer from that, what was happening. Can we do that? It's possible. Is it being done yet? No.
Yeah.
No.
If you look on the Impressions from a Lost World
Yeah.
website,
Yeah.
there are, Steve Gates's work is on there. There's some videos,
Yeah.
and it's really, pretty amazing. You
Yeah.
can see the stuff he's doing.
Yeah.
Do we want to circle back and because you mentioned women in science in the beginning, and just talk a little bit about, are there other women who like Ora White Hitchcock who are kind of forgotten at this point that we could talk a little bit about right now, or just talk more about Ora?
Well, there definitely was a tendency for geologists to marry women who were artists who would do their drawing for them. That happened, the prominent geologists on the website, Buckland, and most of them were named Mary. Mary Buckland, Mary Lyle. The names, of course, escape me right now, except for those two. Charlotte Murchison. So quite a few of them did illustration, and it kind of, I think, comes out of that. Teaching girls drawing and painting in the academies. That was sort of part of the female polish, was learning to do botanical drawings and things like that. They weren't taught geological drawing, they weren't taught paleontology, but some of them did move over to that if their husband's work went in that direction. I don't think there's an awful lot that I know of women independently simply going for geology because they liked it.
Well, there's a history of women in sciencing from the 19th century, and I think today we tend to think that a lot of limitations that were placed on women and other groups of people somehow go all the way back to the Puritans. But in fact, a lot of those restrictions don't really come forward until, I think, really after almost the World War II period and sort of Cold War homesteading. I know that in the 19th century, women who had wealth, right, who had access to those things, were part of these different scientific organizations. I'm thinking of somebody like Erminie Wheeler, who did a lot of work. And so I think a lot of this women's history is not stuff that we necessarily know. They're not people who were published. They were people who maybe did some work for a professor. The professor doesn't put their names on it. But I think women's access to higher education didn't always happen formally, but if you had a father who was interested, or a brother or a husband who was interested, you might learn those things. But it's really different from today, when young women can go to school and get their PhDs and study science. But I know that even in the early 20th century, there were women studying science. You just were expected to stop working, right, once you got married or something like that. So I think there's a lot of history of really interesting people like Dexter Marsh, right, in this valley, who were not necessarily famous or well known because they didn't have the academic titles, or they didn't publish the books. But this Greenfield, but also this whole valley, has a lot of very interesting, shall we say, eccentric people that are worth knowing about.
And it still does.
Yeah.
One woman, not in this valley, but someone certainly, who has gotten, some good fame is Mary Anning, from Lyme Regis in England. She certainly was very important early on. And there's a great novel about her life, Remarkable Creatures by Tracy Chevalier, and I highly recommend that to anyone interested in the field.
Yeah, and this is sort of on my mind because I've recently been working with part of my family who's from Marshfield, so not this area, but I was just showing my students the other day a copy of a mathematics book that was given to my grandmother in 1783 when she was 11, and it's the beginning of her father teaching her calculus and trigonometry and navigation. But the first question is, if a lass has 12 years, how many days hath she, right? So the idea that this is someone who had, she got married, she had children, she died fairly young, not famous, not in the history books, but she had a father who was willing to teach her. And I think there's a lot more history we maybe could be looking for.
There's a really nice website called Trowel Blazers. Have you seen that?
No, great.
It's great. It's got a lot of women specifically in paleontology and geology.
If I could shift just a little bit, because
Sure.
I'm interested to know how it was working with the actors, these young actors, and what they knew about dinosaurs or about this history, and what that process was, what interested them, or how much did you expect them to learn in order to play their parts?
Yeah, that's interesting. Just the way the calendar worked out for this particular festival and the school year, we started, our first rehearsal was September 7th.
Oh my gosh.
I didn't point that out to the audience, but so that basically we had about a month.
Wow.
And generally we were meeting once a week, and then the last few weeks we've also been meeting on Saturdays, and then this week we had 3 rehearsals. So to be honest, it was all about the play.
Right.
But what they, I think I could feel this enthusiasm working with them. I think because kids are naturally curious, and they kind of got that this was a story about someone who's deeply curious, but also because, like they said, kids love dinosaurs, or even if not every kid right now in that troupe is fascinated by dinosaurs, at one point, there's just something about them. These, sort of unbelievable creatures that are difficult to imagine, that we never, that are just from some kind of other time. You try to imagine how a child conceives of the Jurassic period in these, huge stretches of time. So I think what I found was kind of an enthusiasm waiting for the project, which I think helped us through telling this story. Is not it's not what I would necessarily choose for children to act out, because it's these little scenes with specific characters. It's once, I like plays where it's there's a way to structure playmaking with kids that makes it easier for them and for me. And this play is not it.
Yeah.
But a lot of these kids, I've worked with them before, and they just kind of, slowly, it's just a different kind of play where this, but, it's also good.
I liked your device of using the hat to be Dexter, so one kid wasn't always Dexter.
Yeah,
That was nice. That was
right.
good.
It's one of the things that annoys me about, all the high schools. I mean, I know they all do good work, and kids love this. But
Yeah.
when you do like the Broadway musical, there's a few
You get a
kids
start, yeah.
do everything, do most of it, and everyone else is waiting to be that when they become a senior. But there's another way to think about plays for young people, which is really the ensemble and everyone doing a lot, and that's what I like.
If this tape is hopefully going to be aired, maybe we could also include some observations on what are the laws that govern if you're out and you're by the river and you find some tracks. Can you take them? Who do they belong to? There's certainly when someone goes to the trustees of reservation site, they know with a sign this is their area. But we want people to take an interest in the tracks. But what are the rules that cover this?
Well, it's a wonderful question. And I was contacted by the state geologist about 3 months ago with that question and concern, because somebody was going along the river, pulling up tracks and putting them on eBay. And they're looking for an expert in the field to speak to it. I'm not the expert in the field to speak to it, but I happen to, I'm positioned to, run into them all the time. So we got our two friends, Steve Gates and Paul Olson, and one of the two of them is going out to Boston to go testify, with regard to, what to do about this. So it's actually, in essence, it's in process. How to deal with this, because it wasn't an issue before. It truly wasn't. The normal way of dealing with it, if you were walking down along the river and there was a broken rock and happened to have a little bit of something in it, it was just sitting there as a rock, people would pick those up, and that was their loose pieces. And the river is, whose property is it? It's, in essence, it's everyone's property. So, it's a rock. But then you go, the next step is, there's a rock now it's broken. And it begins in, and there's a place to make that rock, more valuable. And that's shifted the way people have had to think about it. So as we speak, literally today's the 7th of October. There's testimony going on as we speak regarding how to handle just that question,
I mean,
And I'm speaking, United States. I mean, property owners have absolute right. I mean, we have, is it your cousin?
He's a distant cousin.
Distant cousin.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, your distant cousin.
Yeah.
Who I've worked with. I love
Yeah.
him. A wonderful guy. You've got Nash's. They own a piece of property. They bought it for the purpose of being able to quarry the stone and make the stone available to the public, and they sell the public the stone, and that is well within, the legal bounds of how to handle it. Some people question whether it's the best way to handle fossils, but in the case of these, I think I was quoted as once saying, just it's a wink and a nod, and yeah, he's a good guy, and because he's running a business, but you can do that. If you're going to a private property, it's a different situation. We have some of our people that have brought some wonderful fossils to the museum, have access to these private properties, and they go to the private property and have permissions and arrange situations with the property owner that I'll excavate X, Y, and Z from your property, fishes maybe, and, you know, you take the best of the fishes. It sounds like I'm gonna go fishing, you take your part of the fishes and I'll take mine. And that's been, you know, successful to this point. So it's still not, I don't know if
Well,
anybody-
on the other hand, if you find them on Mount Tom, you can't take them.
Right.
You know, you cannot
That's
take them off
that's right.
federal property, you can't take them off state-owned
Right.
property, or privately owned property, like the way I'm not even sure how it works with the power company, but they do
Yeah.
have sort of jurisdiction at least over certain number of feet from the riverbank, and so you can't take that.
So I have a anecdote about that, to your question, because it would be maybe about 3 years ago, the Nolembika project, along with our federal partners, we met with one of the representatives from one of the districts downstate, not far away, probably Northampton. I don't want to mention names. So he had introduced a bill into the legislature, and it was really a sweeping bill that dealt with archaeology in the valley, and it sort of imagined or proposed creating kind of an oversight committee, and which was dominated by the University of Massachusetts and the Massachusetts Historical Commissioner, and left out some of the tribes and other interested people. But the motivation for this, and the legislation was put on hold because we objected so strenuously about the fact that it pretty much a lot of the oversight was going to be taken away from, archaeological oversight was going to be taken away from people in the valley and situated somewhere in the legislature. But anyway, the man was motivated, the representative was motivated by the fact that what you mentioned, people could go and mine a fossil, for example, put it on eBay. The fine for being caught was $50. So why not take a chance? And so his
Right.
whole, premise was, let's make it way more, expensive or whatever, prohibitive for the person. So that's still in limbo. That has not been decided yet, and it was triggered by someone going into a state reservation with a jackhammer and getting material and putting it on eBay for thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. So that's one thing. And then a personal story, I guess I can tell it, is that I live right along the Mills River and grew up on the Connecticut River a few miles away. I didn't go very far. And kayaking one day. There's a space, there's a lot of ledge along the river, and just by chance, I was in my kayak and I was just below what's now called the King Philip Gorge that was explored underwater by Dr. Klikowski from UMass. And I pulled in, and there was a nice little rock ledge, and I was just sitting there for a little bit, and I saw this fantastic slab about 2 feet under the water, and it had these pock marks in it, and it was so familiar because growing up literally on Barton's Cove when I was 11, I was rowing around there in my rowboat with my dog, and there was the identical pock marks, and these ones were 200 million years old. So I debated what I was going to do with that slab. And I literally went home and thought about it for a week. And I said, well, it was meant to be for me, So I went back and got it and took it home. And I didn't dislodge it from anywhere, but it was just a very emotional attachment to that particular thing, because it was, you still see that's the same ripple and pock marks in the mud now, in Barton Cove. And there could well be some tracks in there somewhere laid down 200 million years ago. It's just fascinating. And so I had that emotional connection with it, so I permitted myself to take it home. I think it was one of those stories, but I treasure that piece of stone. So Anyway.
As long as you're asking about legislation, I think you mentioned it before, but it's just really important to underscore that Native people did not live in the same time as dinosaurs. Finding
yeah,
dinosaur
right.
tracks and fossils is not the same as finding human remains or grave goods or culturally significant objects. That is a whole different kettle of fish, and those things should not be on eBay either.
No, oh, I see.
Right.
So we, our Nolambika project group and the town of Montague have been focusing on, well, a horrific massacre that happened there in 1676. But it has brought forth a lot of the research that went on, and there is a record, either artifacts or lithic material that go back in that site 10,000 years. So obviously there was, as I said earlier, and you were reiterating, there was no contemporaneous existence between them. But nevertheless, that particular spot has had very spiritual attraction forever. And so right after the glaciers retreated, people were, setting up there. So there is, I hadn't thought about what you mentioned about what the oral history or tales that were told about the tracks that they found, and I really have to look into that with some of our tribal partners who are living a tribal existence truly in the central part of Massachusetts and southern Vermont. One of the tragic things that came out of that while we're on this topic was that when we were doing the study, we found a way to fund these different tribes to write their story of what happened at that horrific massacre, and it is part of the record now. It's online. But the tragic part was that, very painfully evoked, is they literally wrote in, we forgot. We were displaced from the landscape that holds the stories, and so they didn't know. They didn't even remember tribally what happened in the King Philip's War. So that disconnect also, it'd be hard to find an elder who could remember or have heard of a spiritual connection with the tracks, But it was really heart-wrenching to read that, and literally one of their chapters was "We Forgot," and that was the title of the. And so it's very tragic. But anyway, we're pushing, provoking. People are starting to at least get reconnected with that landscape, and like I said, in describing the native word for that area, they say this means a place where fire came out of the rock. So that was, that was a really revelation. So anyway, but I'll look into that, what you mentioned.
That just really underscores the importance of this work, and that history is a privilege, right? To be able to know your history means that your people were safe, that they didn't die at young ages. To be able to preserve your history takes money, to have places to store things, to be able to curate them and demonstrate them. But it's really a reminder that history is a privilege, and not everybody has that opportunity.
Alice, I don't think we have time for it, but you had mentioned when we were talking about this that you knew scholars who were working on the 19th century curiosity cabinet and the relationship of how they displayed objects to the view of the natives have disappeared. But dinosaur tracks were in the same place as a native artifact in the cabinet, visually connecting the two. Is that something you have time to go into, or?
Well, I want to say that's become a fairly well-developed field, and even a lot of our public history students will study like George Sheldon and the founding of the Pocumtuck Valley Memorial Association, and it really goes back to the earliest encounters, right, between ships from Europe coming over here and taking captives back. One of my favorite stories that illustrates this kind of early exchange was not so much putting objects in a glass case, but there's a piece of Mi'kmaq oral tradition that comes out of Nova Scotia that talks about a man named Silmudwe in this story. It was recorded, it was written down in the 19th century by a Protestant missionary speaking to a Micmac woman. And the story tells about a man named Silmudwe who was taken over to France, and he was put on display. They put him in a park, they put some kind of rope around to make an enclosure, they gave him a deer, they made him shoot it with a bow and arrow and kill it and eat it and skin it, and all the people were around him. And because he understood exactly what was happening, he went along. He did the whole thing, but then at the end of it, he basically went into the corner and took a dump to make sure they got the whole process, which is a real commentary. But what's wonderful about that story is it's a piece of oral tradition from here, which tells you that whether Silmudwe was an actual person or whatever the name was, that there were people who were essentially captured by aliens and taken to Mars and managed to come back, not to the same planet, but to their same hometown. And we know that, for example, there was Samuel de Champlain in the early 1600s meets a chief named Messamouet, who we know from historical records was living in the home of the governor of Bayonne, France. I'm forgetting the exact date, but in the late 1500s. So this is actually, and he becomes a chief, and when he's greeting the English and the French, and he's been to Europe, and so it's not just about putting objects into glass cases to study, but people were also brought back to study. So there's a lot of interesting work out there to be done. You can just look up Cabinets of Curiosity, and it'll lead you to it.
That kind of display went into the World's Fairs too, all the way up through the end of the 19th century, maybe even into the 20th. But it was 1893 in Chicago, I think it was. The World's Fair had human beings on display. It's a horrendous history.
And there's a local connection there too, because it's Marshall Field's page for the Science Museum, which is the only piece of that still standing. And it had a huge dinosaur display this year that got national coverage. Why aren't we getting more coverage for what we have here?
Well, we will.
Yeah, but they already did Trackways. They left us out. They talked about Texas and
Yeah.
But this has been a really great project, and it's really important history, and so it's excellent that you were able to bring the young people together, bring the community together, and PVMA with your Jurassic Roadshow website, which is fantastic, and people should look at it, and all the work that you're all doing. It's really exciting.
Right. Dino Tracks History. Is it?
There are two. There's dinotrackshistory.org, which is the big new Impressions from a Lost World website, and that has the story of Dexter Marsh and of the Hitchcocks and all kinds of things, and a lot of other kind of ancillary materials and background materials. And then there's the Jurassic Roadshow website, which is really it's turning into more of a blog, and it's going to be with sort of things that we couldn't get onto the website because the funding ends. Time ends, you have to stop at some point, but there's still all this fabulous material. So that'll be just in blog posts.
you could also catch Fred Venn explaining the universe.
That's right, he's on the website.
A couple minutes at a time.
And David, where would you point people if they want to learn more about the Nolan Beaker project?
Well, we have a website also, nolanbeakerproject.com.
I want to spell Nolan Beaker.
And Nolan Beaker, as a linguist, I joined that project saying, where did you get this name? Because people are mixing it up with Norumbega, and apparently it's an Algonquian name describing a calm place between two rapids. And that kind of tends to explain who we are, kind of an intermediary, but it is Nolumbeka, which is that particular word. I guess it was a sort of an Algonquian, perhaps Mi'kmaq word describing I think Champlain used it to describe a part of northern New Hampshire, southern Maine at some point. But the people who founded the organization chose that name. So people are getting used to using it. But anyway, our mission really is to educate, but also through events, kind of like what you just did, through events, bringing in Native American musicians and craft people. So we have about 4 or 5 of those every year, and it's always posted on the website and all the local media and all of that. But if people were, interested, that's where it could be found.
Great. Well, I just want to thank, David Gruhl from the Olympica Project, Sarah Doyle from PVMA and Jurassic Road Show, Fred Venn, Benesky Museum educator, Alice Nash from UMass, and I'm Jonathan Muir from Piti Theatre Company. I want to thank Tim Newman, whose idea this was, the original.
No, that woman sitting over there, that's her.
no.
Oh, and me for the play.
For the Dinosaur Festival, because
Well, your bee thing is such
Is
a
it not
hit.
true that I guess Tim saw what we were doing with, there's something called Greenfield Bee Week, which has sort of taken a life of its own.
Yeah.
But Piti Theatre does work around pollinator disappearance with a play called To Be or Not to Be with a double E. And speaking of difficult names, Piti, P-I-T-I, is an ancient Indian Pali word that can be translated as joy or rapture. But it's not Piti Theatre Company. I mean, people can take pity on us. On our website, you're welcome to make whatever donation you want.
It's very close to French too.
Exactly, but it's also, if you look closely, you see the little accents.
Yeah.
'Cause my wife is Swiss, and she creates this work with me. And,
That's great.
and so,
And
Yeah.
our other questioner.
Oh,
yeah.
And I'm Linda Hickman. I'm the director of the Montague Public Libraries, and I'm also on the board of the Friends of the Great Falls Discovery Center.
Great.
Which just got a grant to do an exhibit on.
That's true. Yes, thanks to Sarah.
Yeah, we're going to install a permanent exhibit of dinosaur footprints, other kinds of ichnofossils, and it won't have much on Dexter Marsh, I don't think, but it will have a dinosaur. Yeah.
With feathers on one side.
With
right?
feathers on one side.
Yes. Very good.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.